This is a little video about how to use the gradient tool, and it's one of those topics that's just quite a bit easier to show you rather than type 1,000 words and have you try and figure out what I'm saying. So here is my tool panel. Right here is my gradient tool. If I click and hold on it, I can see the paint bucket underneath and the 3D material drop underneath that. If you aren't seeing the gradient tool, then make sure that you hold down your mouse button, have this little flyout menu come up, and click on the gradient tool. Right now, it's set on foreground background gradient, and I'll tell you how I know that in just a minute. But what that is doing is using your foreground color and your background color and making a smooth transition between the two. So if I click on one side of my canvas and then go to the other side and let up on the mouse button, it's going to transition from the black of the foreground to the white of the background smoothly. The length of time I have the mouse button down determines how long that transition takes. So however long or short I make that transition, that's how quickly you go from the foreground, which is over here, to the background over here, and this is a transition area. Okay? So that is the basic gradient tool. Okay, now let's see how we can get some other stuff going on. First of all, you can click on the foreground, change the color, click on the background, change that color, so that you have two different colors, one to the other. Second of all, you can make a selection so that the gradient is going to only be applied in that particular area where you've got a selection. And third, you can come up here to the gradient options bar and click on the gradient that's showing, and this will give you your gradient editor. Okay? Your gradient editor has whatever gradients that you've loaded in here, whether they're just the first few that is in the Photoshop default package, or whether you have gradients like I have that have been added in. Okay, I've got the metallic gradients and I've got the pastel gradients in here. You can also go to the flyout menu. Let me cancel this out for a minute. The flyout menu over here, the little gear, and you can load all of these gradients in as if you want to play with them, or you want to have them available to you, or you just want to see what they do. Those are all automatically included. So, and you can replace gradients with whatever gradients that you want to have as well. You've got all those different options. You can kind of go through those. You can also reset your gradients to the default gradients. Don't save them. There we go. So that's what the default gradient pattern looks like. You see there's your foreground background gradient, which was why it's the very first gradient in the selection, and that's how I knew that was what I was showing you there. Okay, so back again to clicking on the gradient in the options bar, and this time I'm going to make a new gradient. So in the gradient that's showing here, this is where I go to make a custom gradient. Okay, so these down below it are called stops. When I click on the stop, it gives me the color that it is now. I can change that to anything I want it to be. And let me just make it a different color, red. So either of those can be changed as simply as that. I can change the transition time and where the transition happens by dragging this little diamond between the colors, or I can come in and click anywhere and add a stop so that I can change how the colors or how many colors are in the gradient. I can make as many or a few colors as I want, and again, they all have diamonds in between the color stops that let me control how quickly or how slowly they transition between one color and the next. So if I were going to save this, for instance, let me just make one more and get a little white in this gradient. I'm going to change this just because it's going to be a prettier gradient if I do something like that. I can give it a name, pastel. Okay, and click the new button. and that becomes part of the gradient selections that I have available on hand. And those will stay with you even if you reset your preferences, which is something we'll talk about in the future. That gradient editor will stay there. And you can also save any selection of gradients, and that will be something that you can reload in the future as well. If you don't want to have everything showing at once, you can make a whole bunch of different gradient selections to save. Okay, so I'm going to click OK. I'm going to deselect here so you can see it going across the whole thing. Now you can see this gradient does not reflect the foreground background colors. It instead is that gradient I just made. So again, I can hold down my Shift key to constrain it to perfectly vertical, perfectly horizontal. I can change to any 45-degree angle, and you can see how this gradient is very easy to kind of come in here and look at and change the direction of it. When I hold down the Shift key, it constrains it to a multiple of 45 degrees, which is really nice if you want to make sure it's perfectly perpendicular or horizontal especially. We also have, this is a linear gradient, meaning it goes from a line to from one color to another. This is a circular gradient, meaning it'll start from the color on the left and go to the color on the right in concentric circles. Okay, and if you want to reverse that, you click up here in the options bar to the reverse, and it will start from the left again, but it'll reverse them to the right, so it reverses your gradient in that direction. Okay, you also can change the opacity of the gradient up there. So if I go here, that's at 100%. If I bring it down here, you can see now it's overlaying the other gradient, but it's almost 40% opacity. Okay, and dither and transparency you should keep checked, because this will allow you to have that transparency in the, for instance, the second gradient there. And the dither will just make the transition smoother. You've got a kind of a pointed gradient here. I don't remember the exact what they call it. An angle gradient. And this is a reflected gradient. Let me put the transparency, the opacity back up to 100%. This means it will go to, and I just went out of my custom gradient. This will reflect the gradient, so it will be like there's a mirror halfway across it. So if I go all the way here, it's a little easier to kind of see. Okay, so it'll reflect the gradient, and this is a diamond-shaped gradient. Okay, so that is essentially how the gradient tool works. Really cool tool. One of the things you'll find is the black and white gradient on a layer mask, when we start to talk about layer masks, is extremely helpful in transitioning from transparent to opaque. But again, that's coming up in the discussion about layers and layer masks in the future. So that is the gradient tool, and I hope you play with it and have lots of fun with it.